Well, hello, and welcome to the time of men, or the understanding the times of men. Welcome all men, and once again, I am your host, Richard Boyd, to the Understanding the Times, the Men of Issachar podcast, as we talk about and deal with situations and things that are going on today, especially in the world that we live in, because we do live in some challenging times. We do live in some times that are really testing the best of us and making us really wonder what's going on in these last days. I am waiting for folks to come in again, just giving a few minutes for some of you to come in. I want to say thank you. Some of you are coming in already as I'm checking it here. If you see me look off, it's because I'm checking it. I want to say thank you to all of you who are coming in, and it is a joy for you to be a part of this Men of Issachar podcast, or Understanding the Times. Why do we do these podcasts, or why do we do these broadcasts or webinars? Well, we do them for one major reason, and that is that we as men, and I'm talking about Christian men, will understand the times that we are living in. Because, the Bible says that God told Moses to pick men, and he picked 200 men of Issachar, who understood the times. Was it that Moses didn't hear God? No, it wasn't that. This was the time for these men to speak into the heart of the children of Israel. And where Moses couldn't get to all of them, these men could speak into the heart of every man that was part of the tribe of Israel. So once again, thank you for being a part of Understanding the Times. I'm your host, Richard Boyd, and we are talking tonight about men. And here's the unique thing. After we always talk about men, and we address the issues that affect men today. Today we're talking about men running from church. That's right, men running from church, understanding the times. Men running from church. Do we not see that today? In fact, it has been said that there are more women, and it probably is so, even around the world, in church than there are men. And we have to sit back and wonder why. And we're going to discuss some things tonight. Today we're not going to, and those who are listening in the post later on, we're not here to answer all the questions. And anybody who thinks they can, well, I guess they have a handle on God that I don't have. But those who think they can answer all the questions. But we do know that there is a big draft, or a big emptiness in many churches where men are running away. They're no longer in the church. The church is going through men running from the church. We see that today. Interesting enough that Pastor Arthur Culpepper, who comes on these Understanding the Times, and used to be Manlight before, we were previously Manlight Radio, but now Understanding the Times, Men of Issachar podcast, I have found out that he has a church where his men are with him. He has a good 5 men or so that are just solidly with him consistently and have been faithful and so forth and so on. And I understand that people might say, well, that's not much. Well, it's better than none, because a lot of us, a lot of ministers today and churches today don't have that many men, or even have any form of man following or listening to them, or being part of the church. So let's go into it right away. Let's talk about it. And we're going to do with some areas that I think that we can be honest with it. Thank you once again for being a part of the podcast as you come on in. Let's begin right now, and let's talk about some reasons men say they are not church goers, or they don't stay in church. Number 1, today's church is geared more for women. Number 2, dress code too demanding or less demanding. Number 3, worship service intimidating. Number 4, the message and the preacher. Number 5, money. Number 6, where do I fit in? Now, I want to address these issues as we go along, as we deal with this, because it's something that we can all grasp and learn. I think tonight we can learn, but at the same time, I think tonight we can also have an input according to what God is saying. And let's just look at it and see where this thing weighs. We're going to break those down, plus some more, but let's just see some areas that we see that today in the church. So is it right? And I want to say where I got this from, because it's a consensus all around the church. But I also got it. I was watching a pastor speak with 2 men in the church and deal with them in certain areas. And there were 2 men. I'm not sure if there were 2 men from his church or 2 pastors that come in. But the point what I was getting to, there was an older man, a middle-aged guy, and there was a younger man. And the younger man was finding every I guess he was trying to get a point across, every excuse he can to find out why, as a man, he would not come to church or be faithful in the church. And he began to mention some of these things, and here are some of them. We'll go back into it again. Number one, today's church is geared more for women. Now, is that a fact? Well, I can say in my travels, I've been around the world. I can say in our church, yes, there are more women than men. I'm not going to deny that. But I as a pastor and others, have never geared the church for women. Now, is there preaching towards women? Yes. Is there preaching towards men? Yes. Is it sissish? Well, that depends on what level you come from. Because what men need to understand, let's start off first, and we're going to break down both married and single, because the church has a great void when it comes to single men. When I say a great void, there are single men in the church, and the church doesn't know how to reach out to them. It seems like the church is so bent on dealing with men who are married that they're forgetting that we have single men. I'm not talking about young guys. I'm talking about single men. We'll deal with that a little bit later. But is the church geared towards women? Is there, are we finding today in the church that it's geared towards women? Yes, I can say many churches are. And it seems to go that way because of the populace of women in the church. But ultimately, the church should be geared for both male and female. And at times, a message will come to the woman. And maybe when the man went to the church at that time, it came to them. Or it might be in the favor of the woman, but it should also be in favor of the men. So to answer that question and say that every church is that way, that's too general a subject. But I can say to you that yes, many churches, not all, a lot of churches, I should say, are at times can be geared towards women, and it should be geared to both male and female. But keeping in mind now, please, keeping in mind that there are times that certain issues in the church must be dealt with, and you must gear it at times towards a woman, or at times towards men. But on the average, towards both. Okay, number two, dress code too demanding. I think that can be a case in many areas, but that is a poor excuse for you to come to church. Because whether you put on a jacket or put on a t-shirt or you look respectable and clean, I really find that dress code, to be honest with you, a poor way for any man or woman to say that's the reason why they don't come to church, especially in today's society, especially how churches are basically welcoming people as they are. I have never been in a church that I know of, whether I ministered or whether I spoke, or in our church where we get up and give a dress code, or any other church. Now, there are some prerequisites for a worship team, for a group, for men who stand at the door. I understand that. Obviously, it's so funny. You would walk into a store and it says no tank tops. And it would say must wear shirt, please. And even at times, no flip-flops are allowed in there. The reason why businesses. But people will still go in. That is, they will change to go in. In fact, now that we have the mask going around with this pandemic going on, and people will go into there and they'll flip their mask on and then they'll flip it off. And then now the mask has become a fashion, So these are things, we make a fashion out of everything, and that's not what God wants the church to be. Should we be respectable? Yes. Should we represent God? Yes. And obviously we should not go to church looking sexy or provocative. That, I think, is very straight out. Neither should we go to church looking like we don't give a rip. Okay, let's look at this number 3. Worship service is intimidating. Now, I have something to say upon that, because when people are invited to church, men, when you go to church, no man can tell me that he didn't expect any singing. Any man who says, or any woman, or any man, we're dealing with men who comes to a church and says, I didn't know there's going to be singing. Granted, I do agree, we can be left out because we don't know the songs. Maybe you're new. Maybe you're not in the church scene. We have this tendency in the church to believe that everybody knows the church lingo. Church in itself has its own language. Just like there's language for biology, for medicine, for mechanics and airplanes and air traffic controllers, you understand, plumbers, there's a language in the church. And sometimes we forget in the church that people in the church, or people who come in new, don't know our lingo. So yes, I agree that at times that men can walk into the church and feel left out because they don't understand the song. But for a man to say that he walks into a church and doesn't expect worship or is shocked by the music, that's a little bit different. Now, he might not agree with the music, because there's a great divide when it comes to church on that. But the point what I'm getting to is to say that It's like saying dress code. It's like saying, huh, I didn't know. And by the way, on the dress code, I know that there are people within the churches who have been removed or told you're not welcome here. I mean, I had that happen many years ago to a good friend of mine who went in and said, you're not welcome here with jeans. You're not welcome in this church. And I want to say that I think that is really disrespectful on the part of ministers. That's right. And leadership, because the Bible, which I'll get into later, again, as long as we're not sexual or provocative, or we don't give a care attitude, but on the average, that should not be the prerequisite for people to come to the church. Okay, let's talk about the message and the preacher. And I think this is number one before I get to number 5. Number 1, men have complained that the message in the church is not geared towards them, or in a certain churches, depending on the size, the message has been towards them. And I want to say on that level too, sometimes a man of God will get the word, okay? And when you walk into the church, men, when you come in, it so happens that God is speaking to you. I'll give you a case in point. I remember a number of years ago, a man went to a large church, very large church, thousands of people, and the message came forth. And the pastor was one of those pastors in the end who went and shook the hands of the people and greeted them. And as they were coming down, the man came up to the pastor and said, Pastor, how did you know this was my situation? You preached about me. And he says, I don't know you. He says, you were preaching. I saw you. In fact, you were pointing to me. You were talking to me. What was that guy saying? He allowed the message to become personal, especially in a large church. And I know there are times in the smaller churches or churches that it can be directed towards a man or a person who goes, and it can be embarrassing and intimidating, but not all the time. And that should not be, number 4, should not be a prerequisite why a man should leave the church or not. That is something we must understand. The church is a place where the word of God goes forth, and you cannot stop that. And any man who walks into a church and doesn't expect singing or worship, or doesn't expect a preacher to preach, has come into the wrong place. I want to say there's no one you have not invited into a church that doesn't expect these areas, that doesn't expect or doesn't think in their mind they're going to sing and I don't know the songs, or the preacher's going to preach. And I understand the length of the preaching, and that can be over abused. Anything I tell you here can be abused. We understand that. But let's look at the overall and say, well, why are men not coming or staying in church? And I think that some of these are valid answers as I'm going back and forth. Reason men say they're not churchgoers or in church, they're valid, but I don't think all of them can be a valid excuse for a man not to be in the house of God, because the message must be preached in the church. Number 4, the preacher. We understand that many preachers, when a man comes into a church, it is said the first 5 minutes a person walks into the church, they have made their decision. Okay? Some people come back a second time. And I want to say a lot of people who come and visit the church don't even give it a chance. They just don't. They come in and they think right away. And let me throw this out there. I'm talking to men, and also I can add women in. They walk into the church and they come from a preconceived idea of what they thought church was. And the same thing happened to Jesus. When Jesus came up to people and disciples and said, follow me, there were some of them argued. Some of them, he had Nathanael and said, I don't know you. And Jesus said, when I saw you under the fig tree, it was like, whoa. Do you understand what I'm saying? So people walk into a church with a preconceived idea. And they say, okay, and it is known that the first 5 minutes they've already made a decision, most of them, not all, whether they're coming back. Some come in and they're not sure yet. They say, well, let me give it another chance. And I want to encourage you, if you walk into a church, if you're church checking, if you're looking for a church, give it a second chance. Unless you know right away, this is not what I want, this is not it, give it a second chance, okay? And go to that church in an off week. Don't just go on a Sunday or when they meet in the Sabbath. Go to that church on an off day. See how that church deals with personal before. Find out the ministers of that church and what they do before you can start surmising and passing the right judgment. So we understand here, number 4, the message and the preacher. And do not get that alpha male spirit when it comes to the preacher. Yes, it can be there. We'll talk about it a little bit later. One of the shortcomings of men in church is we build this alpha male thing. And it's kind of like, we get this dominant and this territorial thing, which God has allowed us to have territory. But we have to understand that that ministry, that church is a territory in that area of the man of God who's been called to minister there. And so our job is to come in and serve and be a backbone or a backing to that ministry. Okay, number 5, money, money, money. Well, I can agree upon this. Yes, churches are at times, and not all, can have a money issue. We have some churches that have gone overboard, but others, of course, who are good in it. Now, I know there are different ways. I remember one time talking with 2 men, and one man said, well, our church doesn't pass an offering plate. Our church puts boxes outside. Our church, it's only done through this way. And all those things are good, but I want to say, bottom line, the church gets supported by the people who faithfully and willingly give. There's no place in the Bible that God demands that you give, but he has said to you that you must faithfully and willingly give to your local body. Giving to your church is an example of how much you care for that church and where you want to go. I didn't say you have to give your all. I'm saying faithfully giving, faithfully, continually. And men who walk into the church and say they're surprised about giving should never be shocked, because giving is a part of the church. Okay, paying taxes is a part of this country. Joining a social club and paying dues is a part. Paying for internet service, paying for cable service, paying for phone service. I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry. You can't pull that. I won't. Don't get me wrong. There are men who abuse this, but you can't make that a case and take that to court and say, hey, the reason why I don't go is because the church asked for money. Find out how or why or where. Again, what I said previously, you need to visit more than once. You need to get an idea. You need to get the heart of the people and that church before we can start making these assumptions. Now, you might have came out of a church where there was greed involved. You might have came out of a ministry, but you cannot use that in every case. You've heard me say this over and over. When I minister in my church, when I come here on Understanding the Times, when we did the Man Life programs, you've heard me say this over and over, is that just because something is abused, it doesn't mean that God is not in it. For example, God made sex, but there's sexual abuse going on today. Look what we see today, sexual harassment among women, against women. Terrible, even in the church at times, stalking and that. But just because the abuse is there doesn't mean that God did not make something for a good. In the confines of marriage and righteousness, sex is right. Marriage is right, even though there's divorce. Defending yourself and standing for your family and yourself is right within the confines. So that cannot be used. I don't think that men, and I have done it, can use the money thing as the reason why they don't go to church. Okay, number 6, where do I fit in? That's a good question. Where do we fit in when it comes to the church? And that, I think, is what most men struggle with. Where do I fit in as a man? Where do I fit in? Where do I fit in as a man in the church? Okay, is this church for me? Is this a place that I can come to? And that's where insecurity comes in, or superiority or inferiority, because men aren't sure where they fit in. And I want to say again, guys, is give it some time, work it, and see what God is saying in your life as to where you fit in. So we see here, and by the way, as I'm saying this, we as ministers can learn from this, because where does each man fit in when it comes to the church? And I know we can't fit every man, but where do they fit in? Let's talk about dominion. Genesis 1:28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. What does this have to do with men in the church? Well, let's break it down. First of all, God blessed man, first man, and then he said, both man and woman said, be fruitful. So he was talking to 2. He was talking to both of them. Okay, be fruitful. And then he said what? Increase in number. So before he said anything else, and then he said, fill the earth and subdue it. What are we to subdue? The earth. The things that God has put us in the earth, we're to subdue it, but not each other. That's where slavery comes from. It comes from subduing man. God has never said from Genesis 1:28 or through the Bible that man should subdue man unless man is in complete rebellion and is out of control. But God has never said that. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and of every living creature that moves on the ground. So God has called man to rule over, to lead, to rule over, not man, but to lead man. We are called as ministers to lead, whether you're a bishop, archbishop, pastor, rector, priest, minister, home fellowship leader, worship leader, you get what I'm saying, deacon, elder, we are called to lead. And I'm finding in the church that men, yes, at times are not good leaders, good managers of men, good managers of what God, good stewards of what God has given us. Something I'm learning and putting in my heart, that we need to be stewards of men, not dominant, subdue rulers, not domineering, not controlling, but we need to lead. Jesus led by example. Now, did he rebuke? Yes, he sure did. If a man was out of line, or anyone was out of line, or a woman was out of line, yes, he did rebuke, because men have to understand we are the first ones that need to be led even more than women. Now, I'm not saying women don't need leadership, but because God has called us to be men, to lead in the church, to take the authority first. Not saying he hasn't raised up women to some extent, but I'm saying first, because of that, he has said that we are to lead. We are to lead by example. Now, we subdue everything else, subdue things around us, subdue animals, we subdue our dog, and so on and so on. We take control, but we are to be managers and to be guiders of those men in the church. And we see many times that men don't come to church because why? Because they have been domineered. They have been ruled over instead of guided. Another area here. Now let's talk about this. The church, let's get this right in. And I want to draw this out to you because I think it's good to understand what the church is. Because until we understand what the church is, then when we go to church, we will have these preconceived notions of what we think church should be. So men, we need to, and I'm coming to it, we need to gear up and understand what the church is. Okay? First of all, the church is a gathering for all. Hear this. Are churches full of more women? Yes, that's normal. We see that. But the church is open to all. God never closed the church up. Even when Solomon built the temple, he said that all nations would come. The church is open to all. You cannot judge the church by color, and I know we have that out there, or by tribe, or by language, even though I know we have that. Obviously, if you speak English and go to a Chinese-speaking church, you won't understand. But what I'm saying is the church is a gathering for all. Red and yellow, black and white, male and female, everyone, the church is open, should be open to all. Now, does the church allow all to do everything? No, but the church is open publicly that all can come in and receive. A spiritual center. The church should be a place of spiritual guidance. Okay, first. Now, it doesn't take away from the fleshly, but if we get the spiritual right, men, then we get the physical begins to come right. The church is a discipleship base where men should be discipled. Unfortunately, we don't see that today. We don't want men to be dominated or controlled, but they should be discipled. They should be taught how to pray, taught how to be fathers, taught how to live a single life. We'll go into that in a minute. Taught how to deal with the situations of their life and how to grow and increase. The church should be an empowerment, a place where we empower men, to be secure in who they are, not insecure. The church should be an example. In the church, we need the example. The man's job in the church, the leader's job, is to be an example. He might not be perfect because obviously he's not God, but we need to look to men. And men rightly say, I don't want to go to church because the man in the pulpit is not an example. It's not a place to flirt with women, men. It's not a place to treat men like garbage. It's not a place that we treat a man's wife better than him, or we treat a man better than his wife. It's a place of example. Okay, and sad to say, with all that's going on today, we see racism in the church, we see division in the church. I'm talking about the church of Jesus Christ. We see in the church where there is a lot of sexual innuendo going on, and it should not be, even among regular men. Okay, we see that, and there's sexual harassment, and there's groping. I could go through it. That should not be, because why? Because the church, the leaders, and the people of that church, I mean, not everybody, should be an example. I remember a number of years ago, give an example. I like to share this with you. We had a person going to the church, and for some reason they were after some woman, and the woman wrote me and said to me, is this what you teach in your church? You teach men to do this? And I emphatically wrote back and said to her, no, no, no. We don't do that. Why? And I explained to her, we try to be an example. Here's the last one in this. The church is a place of equipping. So men, when you find a church, you should find a place that will equip. You should find a place that's an example. You should find a place that should empower you. You should find a place that is a discipleship, a spiritual center, and a place that's open to all. Yes, on the average, we're going to have more women in the church from what we can see than men, but it doesn't take away the man's responsibility from being the leader and the guidance and head in the church. Titus chapter 2 and 1 and 2, I should say. But you teach what is accord with sound doctrine. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. This is the job of the man of God. Not to be an alpha male, not to be a top dog, not to be big cheese, but to teach older men. We're going to come to the younger men. Teach older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and steadfast. And men, when you come into the church of God, when you come to, this is what you should be looking for, older and young. To be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and steadfast. This is what you should be looking for as men in the church. Let's talk about younger men, Titus 2 and 6. Likewise, encourage the younger men to be self-controlled. So the church should be a place that we teach dignity, we teach empowerment and so forth, and integrity and honor, and men grow, and men increase in the church, and men go out and reach other men, which we're going to get in a minute. That's what the church should be, but it should be a place that we teach men to be self-controlled. And the man of God should be self-controlled himself. It's not about the car or the house or the clothes. And by the way, let me say this. If a man of God is blessed and he can have a better quality of life in this world, nothing wrong with that, as long as it is not flaunted or pushed against any man. No man should be jealous of that, because we expect men, I as a man, I as a pastor, expect the men in my church to excel, and they don't need me. I want them to make the best money, to drive the best vehicles, and to look the best. And if they're married, to look after their wives. And if they're not married, we'll get in that in a minute, and they're single, to be the best. That's what the church should be. So likewise, Titus 2 and 6, we are to encourage younger men to be self-controlled. This is something that we need today in the church. One more time, we'll read it again because I want to get it out to you. So we are to encourage men to be self-controlled. Next thing we see here, let's talk about this in the church of Jesus Christ. What can hinder a man in church? As I said earlier, or hinder a man coming to church. Now, we spoke about some things earlier in the post-program podcast. You will hear this. I'll go through it again. You can go back and look at it, but those who are coming in now, you can grab it here. So first of all, what can hinder a man in church? Alpha male. Men don't go to church to compete with the man of God. Men of God who lead in the church don't compete with the guy in the pew. Okay? And be honest, be open, and deal with men accordingly. Deal in love, deal in character. Okay? authority. A lot of men struggle with authority. You didn't have a father. And one of the things that men should teach is being a father. Even if you're single, what it's like. A father leads. Abraham's name was changed from Abram to Abraham, father of many nations, father leading. Okay, that's what his name was changed to. Okay, authority. We struggle with that. Insecurity. Okay, this is something that we need to understand. What can hinder a man? He can feel insecure. He can feel left out. I have been guilty of that. I've seen that. He can feel pushed to the side. That shouldn't be. We're going to solve that in a minute or bring on the conclusions to it. Okay, next thing here is accountability. Every man must realize that when you come into the house of God, you must be accountable. We must be accountable in our jobs, must be accountable around certain people. We must be accountable. A man who does not want to be accountable is an island by himself. And I want to say this, he will die a miserable life one day. Sad, he really will. It's not a sissy. Jesus was not a sissy man. He was if you look at the names of Jesus, mighty warrior, King of kings, Lord of lords, soon and coming King, Ancient of days, pastor, shepherd, Lamb of God. A lamb might seem that's the humbleness and the gentleness of Jesus. And the Lion of the tribe of Judah. It's not a sissy to go into church. It's just being humble and broken and walking in, men, the fear of God. Another personal issue, what can hinder men in the church? Faithfulness. Men need to be faithful. And I'm finding the reason why men don't excel in church or continue and are running from church today. Yes, that we went through some of the issues, but also because they lack faithfulness. Not faith alone, but being faithful. See, a lot of people talk about faith and preach faith, and it's good, but we have to learn ways to be faithful. It means continually living our lives in faith. Now, let's talk about single men in the church. We see in the church a great gap that they're not of single men in the church. And I mean single men, I mean youth. Not talking about even teenagers, yes, but youth, divorced men, men who are spinsters, like widows, and single parent men. John F. Kennedy said this, do not pray for easy lives, pray to be stronger men. Whether you agree with John F. Kennedy or not, it's a great, great quote, and that's our quote for the day. Here it is. John F. Kennedy, former president of the United States, said, do not pray for easy lives, but pray to be stronger men. We need to be stronger men in the house of God. It's so easy to pray for something to be easy, but when we need to rise up and be strong. So we need to deal with single men in the church. 1 Timothy 4:12. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but be an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and purity. And I want to say this, the church has a tendency to kill young people and young men. I don't know why. Well, I can say this. A man of God I admire a lot said this one time. He says that the hindrance to the next move of God in the church or the growth of the church is people from the former move of God. There are people who grew up in the church, came up young, got old in the church, and when you come to the church, they become that hindrance in there because they're locked in an old way and they're not willing to change. I want to say something. God doesn't change for society. The church doesn't change according to the culture. The church changes the culture. The church, and here's what I want to get to. When I say changes, the church leads the culture. The Jesus culture leads. It doesn't change for the culture. God didn't change because man has changed. In other words, God didn't change during this pandemic that we're all in the web. That was not a change of God. What God did is he gave us the opportunity to use this and minister out there. That's what he allowed, okay? See, we have a tendency to believe that God has changed. God has not changed. He said he changes not. God doesn't adapt. God is still God, moving in the way he is. And he has prerequisites that continue from the time of creation to now that will never change. But they are what we adapt into the culture to lead and to see the culture come forth in Jesus Christ. So we see that. So do not let anyone, 1 Timothy 4:12, look down on you because you are young. Men, you are young. The church needs to have that thing to reach out to young men. And I want to say this, guys, if you walk into a church and something is not right there and you are able to put your part in, give it a little time, then that's the church you're going to stay at, I think you should do that. And there are many ways you can do it. How people say, well, I can't get to the pastor. Oh, there are ways that you can pray, you can write a letter, you can get someone who's close. What I'm getting to is this, and you know what? And if change doesn't come around, you bring it before God and say, okay, God, have your way, because this is not working. All right? So this is very important. Let's close off with the last one here. Proverbs 27 and 17. One of the things that keeps men out of church is friendship. Yes, friendship in the church. Proverbs 27 and 17. Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. Do you see that? Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friends. What we need today in the church is men who will befriend and be friends of men. Guys, go around, and as you're there in the church, as you go into a church, look and say, hey, maybe there's somebody I can befriend. It takes time. I heard one thing about a man who was speaking, and I think I told you this in the beginning as I bring this to a close, that I was watching a pastor speaking to two men. There was an older man, if I didn't mention it before, there was an older man, and there was a younger guy, and they were trying to come up with what they thought or what they could put forth, why at one point they didn't go to church, or why men weren't coming to the church, why are men running from the church today, why do we have this mass exodus of men leaving the church? And so they begin to speak, and the younger guy says, he went into the dress codes, he went into other things, but one thing he did go into, he said he was honest about sports and all that, but one thing he did go into, he said shaking of hands. I don't like to go around and shake hands. That took him a while. But what I'm saying to you, we still need friendship in church. And I have never seen the church, I don't think so, maybe it's a church you've been to, where people have been forced to sing, we've been forced to shake hands, we've been forced to dress a certain way, within reason, where we've been forced to give. It's all a free will. And by the way, yes, there are times that men have been dominant, or pastors have been dominant and said, you better do this or that. But basically, it has been a free will. All right? A free will in God. So I want to say right now, men, let's unite. I want to encourage every man that's listening. I want to speak to two sets of men, because I believe that men are like cars. Men are like vehicles, right? You got the first man you have is a sportsman. He'll get in he got his Mustang, and I'm going to advertise his cars, his Camaro, kind of like I like that, okay? And he likes his Corvette, and he likes his sports BMW, and he's tearing off. Okay, young men go through that, but you know what I'm saying. And then the next man I've learned is the guy, the man who's, in many ways full of himself. He's the one who drives a Suburban, the urban assault vehicles, and he drives the big Fords and the big trucks with the wheels that splash up, and he comes down on tailgates. And he's the guy that is, he's dominant in what he's doing. All right. And then you have the guy who is the executive one. He drives the big car, and he kind of relaxes, and the big Cadillac, and the big 740i or 750i, whatever, the big Lexus, or even has a Rolls Royce, and he's driving. And this is the type of guys, and he's the Mr. Executive guy. Okay. And then you have the guy who doesn't give a rip. He drives an old beat up car, and he just, and he's just going down the road, and he just couldn't care less. And the last one, but of all, I'm not talking about the one who walks. You got the guy who drives the classic car. He just has that thing, that nostalgia for the past. These represent men today in different fashions of who they are. Men, and we need to learn in the church as leaders, and men, we need to learn that every church has a different taste. But we as leaders need to reach out to those men, touch their hearts, and see how we can balance this the best we can. Men, never expect a church to fulfill every need you have. It won't happen. Don't do that. Whether we're single, whether we're married. And churches, like I said, don't take time a lot in single. We throw a single party, we have a single meeting. No, we need to spend more time with the single people and learn to reach the hearts of single men in the church. And yes, not every man in the church will be married, and it's not our job to force every man to be married. Some men are hurting, some men need guidance, some men so forth. We need to understand that and deal with men in the church in that area. Well, I want to say thank you for being a part of it today. On behalf of all of us here, as we talk about understanding the times, I'm your host, Richard Boyd. You can go back to the post. You can also, at the bottom of that social media page, go and hear last week's podcast, and this one will be on and they give us about an hour or so, and this one will be up and on for you to hear the post, and you can pass it out. I want to say thank you once again for being a part of Understanding the Times, the Men of Issachar podcast, as we talk again, and I'll see you next time.